Hello and welcome back to Echoes from the Bog. This is one of our episodes from the restoration series where we're exploring how local communities are involved in peatland restoration. For centuries people have lived with bogs by foraging, cutting turf to heat their homes, building with local materials, while caring for the regeneration of these landscapes as well. Countless other beings rely on peatlands too, from newts being born in bog pools, heather depending on bees for pollination, and carnivorous plants like sundew relying on insects to drift past. But with many peatlands drained for agriculture, forestry, and fuel extraction, these landscapes now depend on restoration efforts to recover their ability to support wildlife, plants, and long-term carbon storage. In this episode, you'll hear from 3 people working on peatland restoration and community engagement. Together, we'll explore what justice might look like for peatlands themselves, as well as for the land stewards, farmers, and landowners. We'll look at themes such as farmers, land ownership, justice, and fair compensation, the resilience of community buyouts and local organizing, and creative approaches that open up restoration to wider publics. First, you'll hear Holly in conversation with Doug McMillan from Green Restoration Ireland, speaking about farmers, paludiculture, and questions of landowner justice in Ireland. Then Holly speaks with Fiona Crawley from Friends of Ardee Bog about caring for a fragmented bog as a community group, building welcoming community spaces, and navigating the realities of a just transition on the east coast of Ireland. And finally, Kate Foster introduces a discussion with a socio-ecological artist, Kerry Morrison, about her work with Team Peat at the Crichton Carbon Centre in southern Scotland, and how art, relational practice, and deep hanging out can offer new ways into restoration. So let's begin with Doug.
I'm Doug McMillan. I'm General Manager of the Green Restoration Ireland Cooperative. We're a non-profit co-op and we work with farmers mainly to innovate new ways of sustainable farming that get some income, fixing the environment and diversifying the monies they get on their farms.
From your work at Green Restoration Ireland, what does nature restoration currently look like in Ireland? And what have you personally learnt from being involved?
So I suppose initially we started out and we were looking for landowners that wanted to restore peatland, probably semi-natural peatland. So it was more of a strict conservation-y type approach. We were looking for ways of getting the money doing this. We were originally thinking UK Peatland Code. But with the Farm Carbon EIP, we were working with farmers. The particular focus was on peat grassland. So I suppose it would have shifted insofar as we've always been focused on the farmers, but we're kind of bridging the gap with our work on paludiculture, winter agriculture. We're bridging the gap between conservation practices and farming needs. So we think this is the way of doing it. So what have I learned? It's that shift. So I suppose starting out it was probably more classic conservation, but now it's very much how do we get money for farmers doing the right things, and then all that conservation stuff looks after itself. Once you get the water level fixed, everything else falls into place.
How do you approach involving local communities in restoration efforts? And what have been the most meaningful and effective ways to engage people? Could you also touch on reliable income streams and the practical implications for farmers?
And what have been meaningful and effective ways of engaging people? So local communities, so with the EIP, it was through the department. We had a spec of the farms we were looking for, had peat grasslands. So that's how we engaged with them initially. And then I suppose through the farmers you can engage with the local communities. And in our current project we're doing a school competition where we're looking at kids that are cutting peat bogs to heat their houses to imagine or reimagine their peatlands once they've finished with them. So by looking at different types of paludiculture, agriculture and forestry options that they could do. So that's that one. And then also we look for appropriate funding for doing community efforts. So we got that in the case of Kilchimar in Mayo, where we got some funding to restore a damaged raised bog, and we're doing that in conjunction with Gary Smith. He's the Kiltimar Amenity Park guy up there. That's a park promoting lots of different kind of traditional farming practices, and also in conjunction with St. Louis Community School. So we did a fantastic re-wet This is more a semi-natural peatland that was damaged, so it's just a straightforward restoration, block the drains, get the water levels up. So we did that with the school kids, about 50 of them over the course of 3 days, and that was fantastic. And that was the quickest re-wet ever, because we blocked the drains. There was a rainstorm overnight, and hey bingo, the next day we went down and everything was wet. So that was that. Just also on that note, we did that the first day. We had a collaboration. We have a voluntary partnership with Cis Construction. So we had 5 of their team came down and were also helping us, working alongside the school kids. So that's the 4th restoration event we've done with them, and it's great fun every time. They're really good at using shovels, and they're good crack. So that was good. Reliable income streams for farmers. And then practical implications. So yeah, I suppose that's the focus of our current project, Peatlands for Prosperity. Basically, what we see is farmers have peat grasslands, but they also have other bits of bog cut over, maybe damaged bog, and particularly in relation to the cut over bog and the damaged bog, there's no income. They don't get any income from this. There's no funding to do anything with it. So we're looking at the alternatives, and that would be in the form of peatland standards. So we've got a peatland standard for Ireland. There's also another European one that would potentially get carbon credits to farmers for raising the water table in this. So we see that as one income stream. They're talking about biodiversity credits. Personally, I think that should just be integrated into carbon along with the water and the community benefits to increase the price for every ton of carbon CO2 emission avoided. And then the other thing is, of course, what can you grow in those areas? So depending on the nature of the peat and how it was cut, it's going to be more acid, it'll be bog peat, or it'll be slightly less acid and maybe more fertile fen peat. So we make recommendations as to what can be grown. And yeah, we've established the first 2 paludiculture farms in Ireland, and the aim is to get to commercial level that farmers can start to get income. And we think that's the key thing, because farmers need the long-term business opportunities. They need that income to stay on the farm and to keep doing what they're doing, alongside maybe traditionally, plus alongside this newfangled agriculture.
Based on some EU projects you're involved in, like Peatlands for Prosperity, have you seen examples of community involvement in restoration elsewhere that inspired you? What could Ireland learn or teach from these approaches?
So, as part of our Peatland for Prosperity project, we bring peatland farmers, advisors and so on to our paludiculture farms, and we show them around. But we've only been at it a short time, so we bring over, I suppose, people that have been at it for longer, experts from EU and from England to talk about their work. And recently we brought over a couple of farming family from Brandenburg in Germany, so Sebastian and Julia Petri, and they're farming 280 hectares of wet grassland, re-canary grass, which they sell for horse feed. And they have done amazing work in terms of developing the new harvesting machinery that's going to be needed to work on wetter ground, and also getting together a group of farmers, I think up to 100 farmers in and around that area that have peatlands, and are working with them to try and get that income, that extra income that they need from peatland farming done the right way in a more of a paludiculture format. So yeah, they're doing great work. They've done really good things. They haven't cracked it yet, unfortunately, but yeah, if anyone does, I'd say they will. And we're working closely with them. That's the other thing. We like to network with people that are getting stuff done. So, we're staying in touch, and yeah, hopefully we'll be able to learn from each other. And we need to get this thing moving, because we've got a lot of peatland to restore.
And from your perspective, how would you best describe justice for peatlands and landowners?
What best describes justice for peatlands and the owners? Justice is that the people that own the land get the income from it. As I said, we're looking at carbon credits, we're looking at paludiculture. Yeah, we want that to go to the people that own the land. We don't want to have a scenario where you have larger companies, so your carbon colonialism, where you get big companies buying up big blocks of peat, re-wetting it and claiming the carbon credits. This is an opportunity. We still have a relatively distributed land ownership in Ireland, and there's a real opportunity here to get money to the farmers, the local communities, and then also into the businesses and enterprises that would be needed to process the materials. So the foods, the new foods, bog berries, process the cattails or bulrushes into building materials. There's a great opportunity here to get money into the rural community and keep it viable. And then also around that, it's a great opportunity to resurrect cooperatives of farmers working together, because, to get that, what do they call it? Not the purchasing power, to get the access, because obviously we're going to start off, it would be niche, it would be high end, but then we need to get it out to the general public. So we need groups of farmers producing significant quantities of materials, getting this to market. So that would be justice for peatlands and landowners, them getting the money, them being able to stay on the land, and then supporting their local communities and keeping them alive with the new income that they're getting from these activities.
Listening to Doug, we hear a strong focus on justice being understood as who benefits, making sure that carbon credits, paludiculture, and new business models actually support farmers and rural communities instead of pushing them out. But peatlands aren't only large, continuous landscapes. Many are fragmented due to ownership, surrounded by drainage and fields, and often fall through the cracks of big national schemes. To hear what community-led restoration looks like in one of those places, we're staying in Ireland and moving to the east coast of Ardee Bog with Fiona Crawley from Friends of Ardee Bog.
Hi, my name is Fiona Crawley. I live in Ardee, County Louth in Ireland, and I'm here to chat about our community group and our bog. The community group that I'm involved in is Friends of Ardee Bog. We got together quite by accident, really. We just happened to be at an environmental network meeting, two of us, and we met up and realised we both had a real love for the bog.
So how did the Friends of Ardee Bog community buyout come about?
We've been together perhaps about 5 years now. In terms of community buyout, if I understand the term correctly, community buyout is kind of taking on a piece of land. What we're doing is we're sort of looking after a little piece, or beginning the process of looking after some bogland that's owned by Ireland's National Forestry Agency, which is called Coillte. So we're in the process of getting licenses and figuring out what needs to be done there. So that's the community buyout that we have. We're all invested in trying to restore as much of their lands as possible. It's at the very beginning stages, but there's going to be so much learning in it.
What are the main restoration needs at Ardee Bog, and what kind of support are you experiencing from the Irish government and other conservation organisations?
It is a forest at the moment, which isn't very good for a bog, so the need would be to take it out, but also it's going to be a very long process. So we're thinking of looking at a continuous cover forestry as an initial phase for it, because it's acres and acres of coniferous plantation. So it's, not in our lifetime type of restoration work that needs to be done on that portion. But there's other little bits of it that are more easy to restore. Like the main restoration needs of Ardee Bog and what kind of supports we're experiencing from the Irish government and conservation organisations. The restoration needs in Ardee Bog are perhaps different to other bogs in the Midlands, because it's a fragmented bog now, surrounded by fields, drained lands. So unfortunately it's not an easy fix. It's a mosaic now, and it's really about creating little habitats here and there. We will not be able to restore all of Ardee Bog because so much of it does not exist. I suppose Ardee Bog is unique in Ireland because it's not part of the Just Transition programme or anything like that. Our bog doesn't have any protected structures in place for it by the government. It's not a national heritage area. It is a proposed national heritage area. So the support from the Irish government would be in terms of local grants. We would get heritage grants. We would get quite a substantial amount of grants where We have a hydrologist working on another section of the bog that's privately owned as well. And the owners are a member of our group. So that's 13 acres, I think. So we've a hydrologist and we've a management plan in place for there. So we're, just on the brink of finding out what drains need to be blocked and what. So it's a big thing for us. And we're really delighted about it. Conservation organisations, we have so much help from LawPro, which is a waters programme.
How do you engage local communities in restoration efforts at Ardee Bog, and what approaches have been meaningful or effective, and maybe some challenges that you may have encountered?
So it's really just our community group that are protecting it. I myself am lucky enough to own a portion of it, a very small portion of it, that we have always looked after, but it is becoming a forest as a result of our neighbours draining their lands. So we keep what we can of it, and we realise that we can't do everything. Irish Peatland Conservation Council and then all the peatlands in the country get together socially as well as for learning. So we really support each other, and we have an organisation called the Community Wetlands Forum, which is really good. They're brilliant. We have a WhatsApp and you just ask questions and it's great. Everybody's there for the right reason. We're all there to protect our peatlands. And who else is helping us? It's really just feet on the ground and getting people out. But we engage our local community in restoration efforts by putting on sort of social spaces within our bog. And you've visited my little bit, so I have just very basic shelters that we can spend time in together. We can do workshops, we can eat, people camp there. So that's how we engage local communities, or local and wider community. And they're the most meaningful, because so much is shared when you're having a cup of tea rather than when you're sitting down formally meeting and trying to discuss something. Like it's when it's shared over food, we find it's very meaningful and a very open, safe space to talk about big things that are going on. And for us, or for me in particular, it's very important for me to make sure we're looking after each other in this. And we would do a lot of nature connection, and I would be a forest bathing guide, so at times we would spend a couple of hours just connecting to the land and looking after ourselves in the process.
Have you come across protection or restoration approaches in other countries that have inspired you in shaping Friends of Ardee Bog?
There's really some really good approaches in other countries. I suppose we don't have very many links, apart from with yourselves, RE-PEAT. We don't have very many links with people in other countries. We just sort of with people in Ireland. Maybe that's something to think about. It's great actually to be talking out loud about this. I'm sure we could learn. We're involved in another project called the Bog Bothy, and that's with the Irish Architecture Foundation, and they have worked and travelled and researched other bothies around the world. They've gone up to Norway and Finland and Scotland, and perhaps some in Germany as well. So the idea is that, the bogs are living landscapes and people have been on them for centuries. But if you put a shelter on a bog, people can spend more time there and interact with it in a different, more meaningful way. I think that's really key for what I feel is a good approach, and it's an effective approach, is when you know something, you'll love it, and you know something by spending time in it. And that's what we as a group, or me, I suppose I can only talk about myself, what I am drawn to is people where we're thinking sort of beyond, we can't cut the turf anymore, or we can't do this. I cut turf probably 10 years ago. I needed it. It was independence for me. But when I learned how important a bog was, I stopped cutting. And I'm glad I've stopped. But I'm in a position that I can, because I live in a house that's very well insulated. So that's sort of justice for peatland owners. I'm lucky in that I don't have to cut turf anymore. But other peatland landowners do have to. They feel that that's a very important part of their lives, as well as they need warmth in their house. So I suppose a little bit of this just transition to be moved over onto the east coast would be good. To look at all of Ardee Bog that has been drained and turned into wet grassland that floods every winter, that's no use to the farmers, but they're kind of intensively farming it, intensively draining it. So if a little bit of the just transition came over this way to look at the landowners here that are trying to turn peat into farmland, I think that's a really important part, because it's about income. It's about, they say, it's about the pocket, it's about the head, and it's about the heart. Everything has to kind of meet somewhere. Some of us lean more with the heart, some of us have to lean with the pocket. So I think that's the justice for peatland landowners. And, it's also awareness as well. Some of my neighbours, lovely people, but they're just annoyed with the land. They're annoyed with the peatland. They want to turn it into arable grassland, dry grassland, and they can't. So if that sort of awareness could be brought over here to Ardee Bog, that would really help us. It would limit the amount of challenges that we encounter. I think I could probably leave it at that, and I hope that sort of explains my relationship with bog.
With Fiona, we've been right inside the reality of a fragmented bog that isn't fully protected, where local people are trying to care for what's left, creating shelters, social spaces, and moments of connection, so that spending time on the bog becomes a usual practice again. Now we're crossing the water to southern Scotland, where peatlands stretch across remote hills and estates, and access can be a real challenge. Here, art and science are coming together to invite people into these landscapes in new ways. We'll join Kate Foster, who's been working with the Crichton Carbon Centre, as she talks with socio-ecological artist Kerry Morrison about Team Peat, creative monitoring, and why deep hanging out might be just as important as any scientific method.
Hey.
Hey, hello, Kerry.
Hello, Kate.
My name is Kate Foster, and I'm really pleased to catch up with fellow artist Kerry Morrison about her work with communities and peatland restoration. We both live in southern Scotland, where the hills are cloaked in peat and there are many raised bogs in the lower ground. These are the most expansive to the west, in Galloway, where Kerry lives. And also there are many smaller peaty pockets in the landscape. Some of these peatlands are protected, but most are degraded. And this is quite a remote area, with many big estates belonging to private landowners. Communities are thinly spread in small villages and towns. Kerry is a socio-ecological artist, and I first met her when she worked with Pendle Hill Landscape Partnerships in England. That's in a much more populated area. Landscape partnerships consist of community-led projects, and the one in Galloway included the Crichton Carbon Centre, which is an environmental charity with expertise in peatland restoration techniques and really committed to community engagement. My project, Peat Cultures, piloted creative work at the Carbon Centre for a wider programme, Peatland Connections, and Kerry became its project officer. And in an exciting new turn, Kerry is now employed part-time as artist in the Carbon Centre to build a longer-term programme of creative community engagement. But Kerry also speaks as an independent artist, as well as being a trustee for a local charitable initiative, the Upper Environment Trust, which champions environment and biodiversity and puts forward community needs to forestry developments. Kerry, it's really lovely to chat.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks for asking me along to chat.
Can you say something about the geography in the different places you work? What does this mean for accessibility?
Okay, so you've mentioned the Pendle Hill Landscape Partnership, and that was in Pendle, which is in the far east of Lancashire. And that part of the world consists of a lot of mill towns, so towns that grew up because of the mill industries. And so they're densely populated. And then Galloway, where I live and work now, as you rightly pointed out, is very sparsely populated. And what is interesting is how the numbers impact on different engagement processes. And so whenever you're doing any work, really you have to think about your audience first, who they are likely to be, who you would like the audience to be, and how will they access the work. So how will they access it both intellectually and also physically? So will they understand the work? Will they connect with it? And will they be able to get to it if it's in a faraway place?
Like the Upper Ur, that one is quite close to a roadside, but a lot of the sites you work in are really quite far and only accessible by foot.
Yes, so the sites that the Crichton Carbon Centre work on tend to be high up and remote and hugely difficult for anyone to access. And those that do access it, so my colleagues, I have the utmost of respect for, because they are super fit and super strong, and actually getting to those peatlands is a struggle, I would imagine, for most able-bodied people. But yeah, so there's a select few that can get there.
So once we've got there, can you say something about what being on a healthy peatland means in practice for access?
Okay, so being on a healthy peatland is wet. So the thing is, whatever the weather might be, you're standing on wetness, and therefore you need appropriate footwear. You need rubber boots, full length up to your knees, rubber boots, so that your feet stay dry and you don't lose your rubber boot in the peat bog. You also need waterproof trousers if you're wanting to sit down. Then, depending on the time of year, if it's winter, you are going to need a waterproof coat, because very often these peatlands are high up and there's mist in the air. And then you're going to need many layers and hats and scarves and gloves. And if it's the summertime, you might not need that, but what you will need is an insect net, because there's many insects on a bog, and you'll need a sun hat, and you'll need sunscreen, and you'll need insect repellent, and you'll need a long sleeve top.
Well, overcoming all of these. Wow. Can you give an example of how you've worked with linking to peatlands at Pendle Hill, where there are already more people using it?
So Pendle Hill was, in a way, that was an easy peatland to connect people with. So Pendle Hill is an iconic hill in Pendle, and for years people have walked up it. It's like a rite of passage. People walk up it at weekends. It has hundreds and hundreds of people walk up there every year. Beautiful circular route. However, at the top of Pendle Hill, it was an extremely degraded peatland. In fact, you could only see peat, so there was no vegetation on it. It was like a black hilltop, which I thought, when I first saw it, was what it should look like, until I discovered no. That's peat that's getting, releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. There's no vegetative cover. So I worked very closely with the peatland restoration officer on the Pendle Hill landscape project. And she was restoring it. So she and I sort of discussed how we could perhaps get people involved in that restoration process. And the most obvious way is to work with the walkers that are already going up there. So instead of going, hey, I'm doing this amazing sort of project and we'd like to get you involved and bring people to the site, we knew that every day there's people going up there. So we created a project where people were offered a small bag of seeds at the bottom of the hill, asked if they would be so kind to take it up the hill. And then when they went up the hill with a bag of seeds, they were met at the top by Sarah and her team, who told them where to sow the seeds, and told them a little bit more about peatland restoration. And then when they came down, they would, sort of thank us for inviting them to be involved, and how important that was to them, because now they feel they have a vested interest in that peatland at the top of the hill, and they will go back to visit the bit that they seeded. But interestingly as well, Sarah was saying she's never ever spoken to as many people about peat and peatland restoration. And also the question came up during that project, when people were coming up with their bags of seeds. People were asking her, well, what can they use in their garden instead of peat? So she had all these conversations that she wasn't expecting exactly. And like I said, she'd never spoken to as many people about peatland restoration before. So for her, working with an artist opened up a whole other avenue, because she wanted people to know about the importance of peat. But within her role, her job, she didn't have the capacity to reach out to other people. Whereas working with me as an artist, I was observing how people use the hill, and then created a project that would involve them with the restoring without actually interrupting those people's channels of or routes, or it didn't interrupt them at all. It became part of what they were doing. So they were kind of, everybody in it was a co-creator.
It feels to me like that's a real thing about word of mouth and the power of speaking to people, because word of mouth in our area, I think, is as good a way as getting the message out as any, even
I
though
have
we're so
to
remote.
Yeah, I have to. So I have to insert an anecdote here. So as part of that project, I made a whole load of tote bags so people could take tote bags up the hill with the seeds in, and they were all hand sewn and hand painted. But I did the sewing and the painting in different locations across Pendle, and one of the locations was a very beautiful little village. And this woman came along and asked about them, and she joined in the sewing. So she and I were sat there sewing, and we were talking about peat and peatland restoration. And she was agog that she and her friends were using peat in their garden. She couldn't believe that she hadn't heard that this was not the thing to be using. And she happened to be part of a very, very British institute called the Women's Institute. And that's where women come together and have meetings and do stuff for charity. Anyway, so she went back to her Women's Institute, and invited Sarah to come and talk to the Women's Institute women about peat and the importance of it. And then what happened was the whole of that group of the Women's Institute started a campaign at local garden centres. They went and they picketed and they did this campaign to raise awareness of peat and not using peat in your gardens. I could never have predicted that that would happen from sewing a bag outside an ice cream shop in a village. But that's what the word of mouth can do. So that's how things spread. So again, with people taking those seeds up there in their little bags that were made for them, which they got to keep. If they use that bag and someone says, "Oh, that's an interesting bag," then they can tell the story. They'll tell the story, "Oh, I met this artist, she gave us the bag, we went up the hill, we met this." So the stories grow outwards. So, the more people that you can reach in interesting ways, the more that story travels outwards. So I know that for the day that happened and the people that I met, over 300 people will have a story to tell about peatlands, which they will then tell to others.
But working in Galloway is so much more remote. And at the Carbon Centre, you're in a place with a lot of technical know-how about peatland restoration. So could you tell us a bit more about Team Peat at the Carbon Centre and why they are so keen to support community engagement?
Well, as I said, Team Peat are this remarkable bunch of people who do work that I am just totally in awe of. And basically what they're doing is they're going up, they're surveying peatlands that are degraded and working out how to restore them. And they put together plans, and then they put together tenders, and then they contract contractors to go out and fix them, and they oversee the fixing of the peatlands. So they're restoring the peatlands. So they, with another team, which is the contractor team, restore the peatlands. So they have all the technical know-how of peatlands, and they understand how they function, how they work, where they need to be re-wetted, how to get them re-wetted. And they're just incredible. So I'm privy to conversations that they have, in our team meetings about the work they're doing on these very remote spaces, and get to see the pictures of them in all wrapped up and blizzardous conditions on these peatlands and installing dams, all sorts. But they are just an amazing team, and very privileged to work with them. So what they do, these kind of awesome heroes, is out of sight of most of us. So no one gets to see what they're doing, what they're up against, why, and or understand why they're really doing it. And people might know a bit, this peatlands gets some press, so people see what understand there's a bit of need to do something with peatlands. People see that money is going to peatlands, but it's about communicating what these guys are actually doing, how hard the job is, and how interesting it is. So when a peatland goes into recovery, how fascinating that is as well. How remarkable it is, and how quickly these, once restored, how quickly they regenerate and the plant life comes back. And I think all of that is important stuff for people to know about. And as a creative, we can come up with creative ways to explore and pass on what's happening in these out of place environments.
Back in 2019, I was part of Sphagnum Splat, which was a kind of community expedition into what had been a Sitka spruce plantation, but had been part of a forest to bog project. And the trees had been felled, it had been re-wetted, so it was being restored to peatland. And I remember this occasion so well. With families and dogs and a special song led by musicians, we symbolically splattered it with bog moss to seed the restoration. And to me, there's a kind of Galloway style. And yeah, I'd love to hear more about your current work with the Carbon Centre or the Upper Ur, something that you're busy with at the moment or looking back over the last year or two.
Yeah, we're talking of forest bog. There's a site that it was one of the first ones that Carbon Centre did. It's on a peninsula in southwest Scotland called the Wigton Peninsula, and it's called the Moss of Cree. And it too was a Sitka plantation that was bought by somebody locally because he didn't want it to be returned to a plantation. He wanted it to be returned to a moss. And so he bought it because, yeah, he didn't want to see another Sitka plantation. Anyway, that was the first site that Emily, the director of the Carbon Centre, worked on. And that site has now been restored. And the vegetation has come back pretty much of its own accord. So there wasn't a sphagnum splat with that one. That one just came back. Because all the seeds that you need are still in there. You know, the seed, there's a seed bank in the peat. So once you've turned everything over, then it actually restores itself in a way. So one of the things that we're doing now is monitoring that site, because once you've done a recovery like from forest to bog, it is such a dramatic upheaval for the land. You're literally ripping out old trees and old stumps and turning everything upside down. And so it's a huge upheaval for the land. And of course, it's going to succumb to natural succession. So trees that perhaps one might argue shouldn't be there are there as well. So we're monitoring the site to see what happens to it over time. And how it's currently being monitored is scientifically. So there are dip wells to measure the water table. Then there are quadrat surveys happening to look at the sphagnum cover. And there's also a couple of acoustic recorders to see if we're getting any birds there that we want in there. But alongside that, I'm in the very beginnings of how do we record the site as artists, so not just scientifically. So how else can a site like that be recorded? And I believe that we can record it in so many ways. So people might come onto the site and write about it. They might contemplate and do some poetry, or they might draw or take photographs. But whatever they're doing as a creative individual, they are recording that site, and therefore it is being monitored, but it is not being monitored scientifically in the same way. But the artist will also be creating data. So I will be one of those artists, and I will be doing it in a kind of more in a sort of robust way. So I will be visiting the same trees to the same sites and using the same methods for recording, but those methods will be creative. But we're also looking to see how we can perhaps implement something along the lines of a citizen science, but it wouldn't be citizen science, it would be citizen art. But it wouldn't be citizen art either, because art can be an off-putting term. So we wanted to find a term that would work. So we're looking at how we can make the site accessible. It's a low site, it's easy to get to in a way because there's a road. There's not a massive population there, but it's not far from Newton Stewart, which is a hub, a town. So people from Newton Stewart could get there. So we're looking at how we can make this work, how we can enable people to get onto the site, to creatively monitor the site, and then for that to end up hopefully in an exhibition, maybe an annual exhibition or a biennial exhibition, so all the work can come together and be shown. And it could also then be shown alongside the scientific data that's being captured. So you're bringing together the art and the ecology through one site and different methods of recording data. Early doors, but this is going to be a 10-year project.
Peatlands come in different sizes, from vast to tiny, and I know that you and Team Peat feel affectionate to the peaty pockets. But can you explain how restoration gets funded, and are there any community implications in this?
So the government is funding the majority of peatland restoration through a programme called Peatland Action. And it has targets because it's a government organisation. It has targets that they want to reach. So however many hectares they want to restore by 2050. So they're working hard to deliver on those targets, which basically means the larger the peatland area that's degraded, the more likely it is to get funding. The larger it is, the more is repaired and restored, and that's great. However, that means that the smaller sites are now being overlooked. So the Moss of Cree would no longer qualify for a peatland action grant because it would be seen as too small. Likewise, with the Upper Ur site, where I'm also working as a trustee, there's a peatland there which would also now probably not get a peatland action grant because it's not quite big enough. And then there are smaller sites still, which we call the peaty pockets, and they might be about the size of a football pitch. We're not entirely sure how big they are because they're not mapped, but they wouldn't be eligible for any type of funding. So what we're trying to do is locate where these peaty pockets are across Galloway, and through the site at the Upper Ur, which is a much bigger site, working with the Crichton Carbon Centre, the Upper Ur Environment Trust, want to turn that into a training site because we can repair it through a training scheme. So the idea is that we would get people to the site to repair it. So they would then learn the skills of how to repair peat bogs, and then somebody who has a peaty pocket on their land that might be degraded might want to repair it but not know how, but then there's trained people in the region. So we're looking at ways that where people can be skilled up in peatland restoration to do small scale peatland restoration, so that local farmers or somebody that's got a small holding can actually look after their peaty pockets.
Whenever I talk to you and other people at the Carbon Centre and Team Peat, it's like people are really important. There's something about, even though it's not a very populated area, people are really valued in your work. And I think it's coming across in your descriptions. Would there be anything you wanted to add about that?
Yeah, people are important. But also at the Carbon Centre, we realise that we are not reaching out as far as we could be. So currently we've been, well, I say we, mainly myself, been focusing on the communities around and about, so nearby communities. And the southwest corner of Scotland, where in Galloway, the rural parts are, well, they're lacking diversity really. So they're very white and, want to reach out to communities that don't have that nearby access to peatlands. So how can we involve people who've never been to a peatland, who don't understand about rural living because they live in an urban area? So how can we reach out so that we're engaging with a way more diverse audience and participants? So that's what we're looking to achieve at the moment, is to broaden our reach really.
About working as an ecological artist, it seems to me you have to be really flexible, and it feels when you describe Team Peat as a whole, you're all thinking on your feet and problem solving and really developing know-how and skills. So just I wonder if you can suggest what approach or skills really help with your role in linking communities to peatland restoration. What kind of things do you draw on in your experience?
I learned a term for it once. I was working with a bunch of scientists on an academic project. This is before I joined the Carbon Centre, and there were social scientists on it. And we were just chatting about what I do and how I do it. And basically, I just hang out in places and talk to people. So whether that is outside an ice cream shop, sewing, or, whatever, I just chunter away to people. And this social scientist went, aha, yes, that's what we call deep hanging out. And I thought it was so funny that there's a social science term for what I sort of do naturally. But I think it is about, the thing is to be in places where people are and just to listen to them, talk to them, created that opening. And then once you've started to have conversations, then you hear things that are of importance to people, to the people that you're speaking to anyway. And that's how you can then create work that is of interest to the people that you're wanting to reach. Yes.
How would you find chanter? For anyone that doesn't know that piece of slang, I mean,
Okay. I've already been chuntering away on this conversation. It's where you basically just chat and have casual conversation with people without really monitoring too much what you say.
it's just such a great chance to connect, and this conversation, this chunter, has been a real reminder about making grassroots connections. It really is about person-to-person contact, and this peatland restoration is happening in a context where scaling up the restoration projects is an urgent priority. And yet you have to work slowly and thoughtfully. I find it quite difficult myself that the finance is directed to the larger landowners when I see so much that could really mean things to people is overlooked in that process. And I really appreciate the kind of work that you do to link people to the smaller peaty pockets in Team Peat.
So we didn't just do the sowing of the seeds at Pendle. We also created a peat pie, because I wanted the word, I wanted to communicate about peatland restoration to a really broad audience, and people that could never get up the hill or have never been up the hill or wouldn't see any purpose in going up the hill. So I hooked up with a local cook, and he and I created the peatland pie. And interesting about that area, so I said it was mill towns, and in the 60s, a lot of people came to Pendle from Pakistan to work in the mills. So there's quite a large Pakistani community. And as a result of that, in the north of England for sure, and other parts of the UK, our diets have shifted. So there's like this fusion of diets now. So where there's influences from Pakistan, India, Lancashire, all over, the world in many respects. However, for the peat pie, what I wanted to do is to bring together traditional Lancashire fodder bean food, which was chips and curry and chips, which is served in a lot of takeaways. And actually an authentic curry, so a curry from Pakistan. So we created this peat pie that resembles the sort of the layers of the peat and the processes of how you restore a peatland, but by fusing together a very British, very Lancashire, white Lancashire, traditional Lancashire food with a very traditional Pakistani food. So the idea was that it was palatable to everybody, to the majority of the people living there, but also to get it into the local restaurants as well. So the peat pie was created.
Social justice and community involvement come hand in peatland restoration. In modern age, farmers are often the first to feel financial loss when practices change. People living beside bogs carry huge cultural and emotional attachment to these places, yet when they face large construction or agriculture interests, it's easy to feel powerless. What we've heard today shows a different possibility. With Doug, we heard a vision of justice where landowners and local communities are fairly paid for restoring peat soils through wet farming. With Fiona, we visited a fragmented, unprotected bog being cared for through small grants, shelters, cups of tea, and slow relationship building, reminding us that just transition also needs to reach places like Ardee. And with Kerry, we saw how art and science can work together, from seed sowing on busy hill paths to monitoring a restored forest to bog site creatively. Using art in and around scientific monitoring brings the wider public into the picture, creates a sense of belonging, and turns word of mouth into a powerful tool. Art is a powerful communication tool, and hearing Kerry's stories makes us think twice about how undervalued it often is in scientific and policy spaces. As Fiona says, justice for peatland stewards and landowners has to meet us in the pocket, the head and the heart, supporting income, understanding and emotional connection all at once. Make sure to check out the article we wrote based on these interviews where we delve even deeper into this topic on our website re-peat.earth or on our Substack. Thank you so much for listening to Echoes from the Bog and for caring about these wet, lively places. Until next time, and in the meantime, we'll see you down in the bog.